No weapon in TF2 exists in a vacuum. It's one thing to see the stats on paper, but it's another thing entirely to see how they fare in a selection of hundreds of maps in a server of 23 other players, all with vastly different skill levels and hundreds of possible loadouts of their own. TF2 weapons are complex, and whilst you could make a case for many to be the most complex, there is one weapon I think is just a bit more strange than any other: the loose cannon. Due to its unorthodox nature, it's often seen as more of a meme choice that's seemingly focused on rewarding skill with satisfying gameplay, rather than real power. I won't deny, it is satisfying, but is it actually good? I mean, theoretically, it has the ability to outdamage any other grenade launcher, but in practice, this is easier said than done. There is more nuance to these stats than you might think, and even after getting thousands of kills with it, I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of the techniques it's capable of. Whilst I will get into some of the more complex stuff later, I just want to start with how these cannonballs actually work, because I still see a lot of confusion on how double donks work, how the projectile's speed and timing works, and how the damage is actually calculated, because even this stuff is pretty strange. So, when you shoot a cannonball from the loose cannon, it gets 1 second before it explodes. Unlike normal grenades, the cannonball doesn't explode on contact. It will either bounce off or go through an enemy. If the cannonball hits a player, it will deal 50 damage, and when the cannonball explodes, it will deal an additional 60 damage. So, without even double donking, you can get more damage than stock. However, in practice, it'll usually be much lower, as both the explosion and the physical hit suffer from damage fall-off. Now, if you want that cannonball to be a double donk, it means it'll have to explode within 0.5 seconds of hitting the opponent, and a double donk will mean the explosion will always be a mini crit. Mini crits do plus 35% more damage and don't suffer from damage fall-off, meaning if you land a double donk, the resulting explosion will always do 81 damage. This combines for a total of 131 damage. However, it's important to note that the physical cannonball hit does still suffer from damage fall-off, which means it won't always one-shot like classes. In addition to this, the loose cannon allows you to start priming the fuse before you fire, which means you can prime the cannonball to explode right after the initial hit for consistent double donks. Considering the whole fuse lasts 1 second, 0.5 seconds is actually quite a bit of time, but in practice you'll find the timing is usually much more tight. The reason for this is that after hitting an enemy, it's common for the cannonball to travel too far past to deal any damage, or for the loose cannon's knockback to launch the enemy too far away from the cannonball. In tight corridors, you can often get away with the lenient timing, but in open areas, it's important to get the timing from hit to explosion as close as possible to minimize this happening. It's also important to consider where you are hitting the enemy. Hitting them in the feet is great for knockback, but this will make it harder to double donk, and knockback isn't always what you want. Meanwhile, hitting enemies closer to the head will direct the knockback downwards, which essentially stuns the enemy and it makes double donks much more reliable. Furthermore, hitting enemies in the center will usually cause the cannonball to bounce off, whilst edging the enemy will cause the cannonball to continue on its trajectory. And yes, that means you can double donk 2 players with a single cannonball. Additionally, if you kill the enemy with the initial hit, it will always continue on its path, which sometimes allows for a nice collateral. Now, so far, this is all relatively standard stuff as far as TF2 is concerned, but as with lots of TF2 spaghetti code, there are ways it completely breaks down. When the game does the check to see if the cannonball is a double donk, it doesn't actually distinguish between the different cannonballs you have fired. This means it's possible to miss a cannonball but still have the explosion count as a double donk if your next cannonball hits the opponent within 0.5 seconds before the first one explodes. It's essentially a double donk split up between 2 cannonballs. It's a niche but pretty interesting mechanic, but it goes further. It's actually possible to cause the cannonball impact itself to count as a double donk if it hits the opponent within 0.5 seconds of another cannonball directly hitting. As the fire rate is 0.6 seconds, the developers must have thought it wouldn't be a problem, but as it turns out, by walking, charging, or jumping forward, you can make the timing work. And as the cannonball's explosion can still double donk, this means you could theoretically get 3 double donks on 1 player with just 2 cannonballs. As far as I'm aware, Happy Cultist was the first to document this mechanic, and that's how I personally discovered it. Already, this is amounting to much more peculiarities and variables compared to most of TF2's weapons. But it does not end there. Despite the cannonballs being much larger than the other grenades, and clearly made out of metal, the game still calculates their weight as 5 kilograms, which means they end up suffering from much more air resistance than the other grenade launchers. Do not let the plus 20% projectile speed fool you. Not only that, but those massive cannonballs have the exact same hitbox as the other grenades, so you end up having all the negatives of a large projectile with none of the benefits. When combined with the low fuse time, this means there is a hard cap on how far you can shoot, and hitting enemies at medium ranges will require more compensation than any other grenade launcher, whilst requiring the exact same level of precision. This makes it quite difficult to use at medium range, and even when you do hit double donks, they'll often do only around 120 damage. Meanwhile, when fighting enemies too close to you, you have to spend precious combat time priming your shot for a double donk. This is time that could be spent reloading, switching weapons, or even going outside. This means if you really want to get your value from the loose cannon, you need to keep your enemies close enough to donk, but not too close or you'll waste time priming. These range limitations will define your fights with the loose cannon, and it's something you'll always have to keep in mind with your positioning. Now, with how difficult it is to consistently control all these variables and hit double donks, is it really worth all the hassle for roughly 30 more damage compared to stock? Well, it's really hard to overstate just how significant a plus 30% damage grenade is. The difference between killing light classes in one pipe compared to 2 pipes will make every one of these interactions easier, provided you can get within range. When you get the drop on the enemy, the initial burst damage will secure the kill before they even have a chance to retaliate, and will save you 1 more ammo for the next encounter. Tankier enemies that survive will often get thrown into the air, and while sometimes they will fly to safety, if you aim the knockback well, it can put them in a vulnerable position where either you or your team can finish them off. And if they don't die when in the air, there's a very good chance they die when they hit the ground. Because of the way TF2 scoring treats fall damage, it's easy to overlook just how much of an impact it can have in fights, but in practice it's common, albeit a bit unreliable, for donks to do an additional 20 to 30 damage in fall damage, which means you can easily end up causing over 150 damage with just one cannonball. If the map and loadout can support the cannon's lower range, you can achieve more consistent, sustained DPS. Another great aspect of the increased knockback is its sheer power in denying Ubers. A couple of well-placed cannonballs can single-handedly defend against an Uber whilst putting yourself at very little risk compared to other options such as the Holiday Punch or Flamethrower Air Blasts. As I was gathering clips, I realised just how common it is to be on the front lines against an Uber as a demo, and being able to prevent it with the loose cannon always felt impactful. Another small benefit I have to mention is that the Double Donk logo will hover above invisible spies, which means you can track dead ringers or invisible kunai spies. It's small, but it's just another thing you can add to the list of ways spy gets screwed over. As nice as double donks are, they aren't the only benefit that cannonballs have when fighting opponents. You'll obviously still need to hit them when you can, but the controlled fuse is a better tool than you might think. Have you ever watched Meet the Demo Man and remember seeing this scene? Well, unfortunately, once a grenade hits a wall, it loses its player collision, meaning you can't actually perform this stunt in-game. And whilst this does go for the loose cannon, the short fuse time makes performing similar stunts a reliable way to get damage with the loose cannon. The cannonballs can be used in a similar manner to airburst stickies or the detonator, where you can hit enemies around corners, or as a reliable way to finish off low health enemies. When you know an enemy is low, you don't actually need to get a direct hit, because as long as your shot is close enough, you'll get some damage off. When you don't have stickers equipped, this can be quite handy, and even if you do, it doesn't require a weapon switch, and it can be detonated much quicker. This concept applies to every missed shot. When you miss a normal pipe, you still get area denial in the form of rollers, but it gives plenty of time to avoid damage, and rarely kills. However, when you miss a loose cannon shot, you'll often get 30 to 50 damage instantly. Whilst these are small damage numbers, over the course of a fight they do add up, and it means you can often win fights through death by 1,000 paper cuts. When you take this into account, I don't think the weapon is as all or nothing as people often make it out to be. Another great example of how the controlled fuse can be useful is when you are fighting a pyro. The reflected shot will rarely get close to you, and without good timing, the pyro will often take self-damage from the reflected shot. This is a particularly nice benefit on Hybrid Knight, where a good pyro can make initiating a fight very risky. Furthermore, priming the fuse to the maps, aiming backwards and crouch jumping can also be used to explosive jump. Whilst it is quite situational, it can still be a nice trick to have up your sleeve, especially when sticky jumping is not an option. It's more powerful than normal grenade jumping, and it gives you much more control as it doesn't need to be detonated on the ground. It will quite consistently do around 72 to 74 damage, as will accidentally overloading when fighting an enemy. When combined with a shield, it allows some very unique movement tech. Another thing you'll have to keep track of is whether it's best to even prime the fuse at all. Sometimes you just won't have time to prime the fuse, and firing straight away is your only option. Usually, these are scenarios where the other grenade launchers excel, but the quick knockback can sometimes save your life, especially against classes which can tank a pipe, like heavies and demo knights. Because the initial hit counts as a stun, it will always stop a demo knight, which can occasionally save your life, and you'll often avoid self-damage in the process. Before I move on, the last situational mechanic I want to talk about is that you can always switch onto another weapon in order to cancel the fuse. This usually ends up taking just as much time as reloading, but it can be used when you need to avoid blowing yourself up, or when you really need to conserve ammo. Now that I've talked about most of the loose cannon stats and its mechanics, I want to talk about how it actually fits in with all of TF2's different maps and loadouts. I tend to play on a vast variety of maps, and this generally includes trying to use the loose cannon in every type of situation. But it became very clear early on that the loose cannon is the most area dependent of all of Demoman's grenade launchers, and I think this is partially why it's often seen as a weak choice. Taking a quick look at Demoman's grenade launchers, I would say that the lock and load is the most offensive, as it excels in long-range, open areas. The stock and iron bomber are good all-rounders. Meanwhile, the loose cannon exists on the opposite side of the spectrum, right next to the bootlegger of course. Its stats get best utilized when playing defensively and in more enclosed areas. Maps like Dust Bowl, Two Fort, or Barn Blitz, I really do think that the loose cannon is a genuinely good choice for Demoman's primary. The tight corridors are perfect for hitting double donks, and the combat tends to take place at an ideal distance, which means you won't be wasting much time holding down the fuse, and you'll also rarely be outranged. In these enclosed maps, the knockback will often stun enemies into corners, and in defensive scenarios, you'll get much more utility from the knockback. Now, I finally want to talk about how different loadouts actually synergize with the loose cannon, and what I find tends to work best. If you're truly tryharding with the loose cannon and using it on enclosed maps, then I'm going to be honest, it's probably just stock. Whilst the cannon can sometimes struggle when you need instantaneous damage, careful positioning and good use of stickies can prevent you from being caught out, which isn't too much to ask when defending on these enclosed, choke-pointy maps. The loose cannon has even been used in a similar style in both Highlander and Sixes, apparently. I haven't actually gone through the effort of checking. So, this is undoubtedly one of the more optimal pairings for the loose cannon. However, I think this is mainly due to just how strong the sticky bomb launch is, not because of some unique gameplay synergy. What I really want to talk about is how well it accommodates for Demoman's alternative playstyles. They might not be strong in the general competitive sense, but in the chaos of casual, it's completely different. Both the sticky jumper and Demoman's shields give mobility that allow you to work around the loose cannon's shorter range. And when you control which fights you take, you can really start to utilize the increased damage from double dongs. When you give up your sticky bomb launcher, you really need to make every shot count, and that's exactly what the loose cannon allows for. Whilst I find these loadouts still generally struggle when attacking through tough holds, they can be quite strong in deathmatch-like game modes, such as King of the Hill or Capture the Flag. You can easily place yourself into the most optimal environments for the loose cannon, and with the ability to take out light classes with a single shot, you become, dare I say it, a sniper counter. The ability to get damage around corners also becomes more valuable when you don't have a sticky bomb launcher to do the exact same job. Also tried using it quite a bit with the Scottish Resistance, and whilst the increased single target damage was nice, you're essentially doubling down on playing defensively. With very low range and no movement options to compensate, I felt more like a turret than an actual demo man. It was very powerful for holding a point, but the moment an enemy got the jump on you, you're pretty defenseless. It is a weapon I've been using a lot though, and I do think it's got more potential than people tend to think. To finalize my thoughts, I just want to say that despite doing all this research and gameplay on the loose cannon, I still feel like I'm nowhere near the potential that this weapon could reach. There's very likely some loadout combinations or methods of use which are more or less powerful than I think, so regardless of whether you're highly skilled or new to the game, I'd really recommend experimenting as much as possible. I do think the weapon has some notable weaknesses, but these can be worked around, and I believe it offers real, tangible strengths. Once again, I'll say, for a game where you can switch weapons as you please, a weapon doesn't need to be good in every single scenario. It just needs to be situationally better than the other options. I often think the skill people have gained from an already established weapon can blind people to some of the potential of the more unique playstyles or weapons. If you've made it this far, then I really want to thank you for watching the whole thing. I've got many more ideas planned, and hopefully the quality and ideas will only get better into the future. If you've got any ideas or thoughts about the video, then please leave a comment below, and subscribe if you want to see more. Once again, I really mean it. Thanks for watching. Peace.
What the hell?